Sad jednu ovako. I extension goal.
Hello everybody and welcome to the final round of the final debating round of Arandjelovac Open 2014. We'd firstly like to congratulate all 4 teams on making it to the final and generally all teams for a very good performance during the tournament. Thank you guys, it was a pleasure. In opening government, we have gentlemen never tell. In opening opposition, we have severe Gravitas Shortfall. In closing government, we have Pepe. And in closing opposition, we have Augusto Pinochet. We would like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the final debate on the motion that stands in his name. Hear, hear.
It's a cold, cold world out there, cold like the water in this hotel. we want to warm it up a bit. Madam Speaker, we think we see the clear problem currently, our citizens having the right and saying as a state that they have a right for self-defense, and we as a state not providing them a tool to do that actually. We think that's a big problem. We think it's a perfect idea for all the citizens of the Western liberal democracies to bear arms in order to appropriate and match the right that they currently have for the self-defense. We exclude some of the categories, of course. Firstly, we exclude people who have criminal records from before. Secondly, we exclude people with mental disabilities and people who are not mentally capable of actually bearing such rights. And also we will withdraw such rights for any further people who show such behavior. But what we want to do, firstly we want to do a couple of points. We want to talk about currently inabilities, the police system that was implemented by the state, actually, and what are the problems of that. Secondly, we want to talk about, and thank you, how governments are less able to manipulate and actually to abuse their citizens if we do this. Thirdly, we want to know that what kind of a deterrent sends to the potential criminals with this. Finally, we want to talk about nations' right to self-defense and equalizing the people and disbalances that exist between the certain groups in the society. But let's go on. Firstly, we think that current system of policemen has many problems. Police simply is unable to be at every point on all the streets wherever our citizens are, especially during the times of night and under these special circumstances. We think that this inability that police shows is actually removing the deterrent that we think that there is in the law that forbids apparently people to actually attack us. We think that that's problematic. We think that this puts that deterrent back. Furthermore, we see that for example, secondly, we think that a good example of this is when in Mexico recently, when we had this situation that people were unable to defend themselves from the drug lords and similar, that when they finally got to the arms, what they did because of the inabilities that police has is actually they attacked the drug lords and removed actually criminal from their own streets. This is perfectly depicts how people are able actually to demonstrate rationale even when faced with this tough, even when faced with such responsibilities. Thirdly, we think that governments are less able to abuse their own population if the minority groups that exist there are also having the arms together collectively with majority groups. Good example for this is Switzerland. And we think in general, Switzerland model of giving arms to citizens is quite good, and we would think that we would, no, thank you, we actually adopt the same principle. We want to say that the Italian minority within Switzerland is pretty much protected from many bad governmental policies that majority group would actually employ here because of the fact that they have arms. Now, furthermore, going to no, thank you. We think that no, thank you. A bit later. Now, when we call upon and another example that was demonstrated by Switzerland is, if you take a look, and this is where we come to this idea of the right of the nation for its defense. We think that when the reason why Finland is not given to Soviet Russia was that Finland had arms, simply wasn't so easily to tackle and to attack these citizens. Secondly, we think that Switzerland was never invaded during the Second World War just on the fact that everybody had arms, while other countries. At this point, no, thank you. But we'll come to that afterwards. It's quite a good deterrent tool in that sense when people have it, because you are potentially afraid of the usage of these materials in the future. Similarly, on the regular daily basis, we think that deterrent that criminals do not feel now comes along when they are, firstly, nobody who has criminal record doesn't have a weapon, but everybody that doesn't has, it says the clearest message to the people that are potentially going to do criminal activity to think twice whether they will actually engage in such a construct. Sir?
So if I gave everyone in the Hispanic community in the USA a gun, they would be able to fight off the US Army.
Not per se the army, but they will definitely be, the government policy, when employed, might consider that there is a group of people who might consider to bring a border and defense on this system. If nothing else, good example for this would be, just in the other way, if they would be able to make a defense of the certain entity. If Kosovo Albanians would have arms during Milosevic's era, probably much sooner would we get the resolution of Kosovo issue. No, thank you. Coming to equalization of these balances that currently exist in our societal systems. We think that many of these balances are based on the ability that people perceive each other as not equally powerful. For example, men versus women, weaker versus stronger, minority versus majority. This believes that certain people are not powerful as you are, and we generally attach belief of how much somebody is powerful, we attach to the fact of how much they are able actually of damage inflicting on you. Then we actually, in these societal tensions that are created, we see that these guys who think that they are stronger just because they are in majority and similar, do not actually appreciate and actually do not perceive the people that were in hand as equal. We think just because of this association of power, it leads us to believe that if you as a man actually know that the equal amount of damage that you can maybe potentially inflict on a woman, she can also do it to you, makes you perceive it as equal in a sense of what kind of to the powers of your own. And we generally position in a hierarchy of a social ladder people upon this power, even in the rate of the structures of how much do we appreciate someone. Secondly, we think that also this leads to the equalization of all the other social groups that exist in our society. Because, for each member of each of these minority groups, that they have perfectly same ability as you are in terms when determining how much damage they can actually inflict on you. Because of this perfect resolution and because of what my friend Emmanuel will gonna bring you later on, please vote for us.
We thank the Prime Minister for his speech and would now like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to open this debate for the opposition side. Here, here.
It is always a problem when opening government tell us that the state should design policy based on the probability that it will one day collapse. We think that's a bad way to go about making your state function. We think furthermore that it is malign for them to suggest that guns are about the protection of the weak against the strong, about the equalizing effect of this lethal weapon. The vast majority of gunshots in the US are not fired at criminals. They are fired in kitchens. They are not fired by women against abusive men. They are fired by men who kill their wives in a fit of anger. The idea that it equalizes force is a lie. In the US, the vast majority of victims of gun crime are black. You would think by the logic that it was the white community that was being fought against by the black community using guns. Huge lies, not the way the world actually works. Two things. Firstly, why we do not think the analysis about the right to self-defense actually works the way they think it will in the real world. Secondly, why in those countries which we all admit will have to ban these guns, because we support a total ban of these things in all Western liberal democracies, why we think the black market will disappear and we reduce crime and they make it worse. Before that, small bits of rebuttal. The first thing they say is that we will prevent people with criminal records or with mental injuries from getting these things. No. Just because at the point of purchase it's not a criminal or a mentally ill person getting it, does not mean that gun can be passed to a child or be stolen by a person who has these things. More on that later. But then they say, we need the state, we need people to do this because the state monopoly of force is not perfect. We agree. We think you make it worse because the reaction of criminals now that they know that people might have guns in their homes is not to go, well, time to give my criminal lifestyle. They just get assault rifles instead. And those are far more indiscriminate. That's exactly what we've seen happening in the US. Then they said, well, the government's now no longer manipulate you, and the example was Switzerland. Number one, the reason why Switzerland does not oppress minorities is because it has a canton system, it has like direct democracy, those things are quite nice. Secondly, the reason why it wasn't invaded in World War II was because, as we found out earlier this tournament, it was neutral, right? So, again, bizarre example, right? Also, seriously, handguns against planes bombing you from 45,000 feet and tanks rolling through your streets in a real war, not a deterrent. If in fact, give soldiers of the army an excuse to shoot at you because you're now an armed combatant. The laws of war no longer apply to you. So that was, again, a bit silly. This thing about minorities, I'm going to tell you why actually minorities actually make it a lot worse. So, firstly, therefore, self-defense. Does it actually work that way? 5 layers of analysis. Firstly, we'd like to point out that when people are afraid or when they're in a fit of anger, they use these things in a way that magnifies previously existing asymmetries of power. The people who are more likely to use these things are people who are already habituated into a culture of violence, who already think that they have a right over other individuals. That's why the vast majority of individuals who are killed by guns in the US are women who are in households where the man in a fit of anger takes out a gun and shoots them. So we don't think that characterization worked. But secondly, we think that it's not true that if you have a gun and a burglar comes in, it is a good way of defending yourself. Why? Presumably, as happens in the US, most people keep their guns in a safe, right? No, thank you. You see the silhouette of an armed burglar coming in the dark, without making a noise, so that the burglar doesn't know. You need to go over to your safe, find the dial and the numbers in the dark, open it, put it in the ammunition, and for the first time in your life, try to shoot a human being. The point is, even people with guns rarely actually use them in these sorts of intrusive situations. There are all kinds of psychological barriers to people actually using them. That means they don't actually get what they want to talk about. Furthermore, the reaction of organized crime is not to stop. I'll take closing in a moment. The reaction of organized crime is to have even more egregious weaponry that presumably they are not going to want. Because they didn't tell us they were going to do rocket-propelled grenades. So they must have some limits. Whatever criminals do, they just shift to that area where you think they shouldn't have. Go. Yeah.
The reason why women don't usually have the possession of guns is because they believe that that right is exclusive for men. The same thing as we might think about the government, that it is exclusive for government to have weapon against you.
Absolute rubbish. In the US, the Republican Party tells people, end on end, every election cycle, you have a right to bear arms. The Second Amendment guarantees this, right? The US is a country where everyone is told that this is fine, and yet women still are by and large a victim of gun crime. Just because the government tells everyone technically has equal access, that does not create a shift in the way society perceives women. That requires the overturning of 300 years of misogyny, which we don't think legalizing guns is going to do. So, again, fear and anxiety means it doesn't work. Thirdly, we tell you often these guns are used in situations of panic and accidents, right? So you look at the case in the US again, right? Where a pregnant girl coming in through the window at night was shot by her own parents who thought that she was a burglar. You look at the fact that black kids in inner city areas in New York are shot by white men who think that they're burglars because they look suspicious. And as the case of Travian Martin shows, you can't even prosecute these individuals. So pre-existing social biases about what it means to be a criminal now have much more severe consequences when a weapon whose only purpose purpose is to enact lethal force is now used to create those sorts of biases. Knives are much more difficult to use, right? Because you need to go up close to someone and risk yourself being injured, right? A gun allows you to kill someone from a distance. That's why that's not how it works. Furthermore, the reaction of many criminals is therefore to just shoot back and kill people. So again, we don't think that works. Last of all, we say, just because of the fact that you ensure that people who buy it at the point of entry are not criminals and are not bad people or mentally ill does not mean that it doesn't fall into the hands of people who are like that. So, many of the school shootings in the US, right, were committed by disturbed kids, often with psychological problems, who never bought guns themselves. They took the guns that their parents had, went into schools, and massacred sometimes tens of children. So even if you say that, we want to prevent these people from getting it, the guns end up there eventually, and they're the people who will do the most harm. Good people rarely use guns. Bad people often do. That's the basic asymmetry I'm talking about. So, lastly, black market. Why do you think we can effectively crack down in countries where we should? Firstly, there are countries where we have managed to get rid of the black market by and large. Two very good examples are Hong Kong and the UK. Why? Firstly, because by and large, people do not like risking going to jail by buying guns illegally, right? That covers the vast majority of people. But secondly, guns and the ammunition that you need to use to operate them require very long and delicate supply chains, because ammunition is very difficult to transport. You need lots of specialized equipment. Governments can tackle these supply chains, destroying the supply chain at one note, raiding one legal warehouse, disrupt many of the supply chains further down, which makes it difficult for you to provide these sorts of things. Furthermore, we tell you, it's often easier to enforce a bright line rule between what is available and what's not than distinguish between illegal and illegal weaponry. Because now we know whenever there's ammunition, it doesn't matter what gun you're using it for, it is illegal. And in their world, the only effect is that gangs now tell ordinary people who have bought guns, if you want to join our gang, just take that gun from your parents instead, right? That's why you make it easier for criminals to get hold of these in your world, because they tap on legal supply chains to get these things cheaply in our world. It's a lot more difficult. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
We thank the leader of the opposition for his speech and would now like to recognize the Deputy Prime Minister to further this debate for the government side.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'll just ignore that. Before I start my speech, the Saloniki Open 2014, October 31 to November 2. It's going to be good fun. You should all come. Second thing, when we were playing with Marco outside, like having our cigarette, we knew that all the opposition would come up with is America, 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 so off, America's this, America's that. Obviously ignoring everything we said about Switzerland, which has one of the highest personal gun ownership rates in the world and almost zero crime, right? So maybe it's not just the guns that are at fault. It might be, for instance, that the Americans are a bit bad at gun control, which, for instance, we recognize as, obviously it's not a good idea to reject policies simply because one nation hasn't been able to enforce them. But then he goes like, oh, there's black kids getting shot by white men, there's this and that, and like that happens in America because of the guns. Yesterday on the BBC, the front page news was that a 15-year-old girl got shot in the United Kingdom, in London, in the streets of one of Europe's busiest metropolises where guns have been banned for ages, right? We simply do not buy the idea that if guns aren't legal, a black market doesn't exist because the supply chain is too complicated or whatever, or people will not find their guns. And for crying out loud, we live in the Balkans. Probably half of you know where to buy an AK-47 tomorrow morning, right? Now, this whole idea of but victims are disproportionately black in the United States because of guns. It's not because of the guns that the victims are disproportionately black. It's because of social inequalities in the United States that exist because of things like slavery in the past and so on and so forth, right? When you look at places like Switzerland, which have been far better at alleviating those problems because they don't operate a free market, they're not libertarian and so on and so forth, they're a bit more welfare-y, you see that those problems aren't there. But again, you can't pin that problem on the guns themselves. Children can find guns. Well, they can also find a car and go and kill themselves. We still give people the right to drive. They can also steal a knife from the kitchen and do something stupid with a knife in the kitchen. Again, do what Switzerland did again, for instance, and demand that people have a safe. Oh, wait a second, says Assis. If you have a safe, it's really hard to get your gun if the intruder comes in. Whereas Marco's point is that the intruder will think twice before they come in if they think that there's a potentiality that you might have a gun in your hands, right? No, thank you. Which is the point. But even if it is in a safe, like probably you have enough time between when the burglar comes from the door to your bedroom to go in and pick it up and do what you have to. Then he says, well, guns are only there to kill people, right? Like there's no other objective way in which you can use a gun. Right? So shooting in the air is something that people have been known to do for ages, to threaten, right? Pointing a gun at someone only has the effect of making that someone do what you want them to do. In the case, not attack you, for instance, right? And you wouldn't go toting guns on other people that might have guns, which also helps what Marco told you about how like it sort of disincentivizes people to be dicks at each other. So excuse my French. Right?
Information.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Switzerland doesn't have a right to bear arms. It's just that men who have been in the army get to keep the arms. Only a very small subset of the population, especially trained.
Yeah, right.
Guns.
Okay, so Switzerland demands, fine. Switzerland demands of its entire adult population to have arms and, in fact, automatic weapons, right? So the sort of bad guns he talked about at their houses, so that they can defend Switzerland in case Switzerland ever gets invaded by anyone, right? Which it doesn't because they've got guns. Everyone seems to have a gun in Switzerland because it has one of the highest gun ownership rates in the world. You just can't get away with saying that there's no guns in Switzerland. Crying out loud. And we think they should extend it to the full right to bear arms because it's so beautiful, right? And also, then there's this notion that, the organized crime will just get more and better and bigger weapons and, rocket-propelled grenades and I don't even know. I haven't heard of the Swiss mafia. Has anyone else heard of it in here? This is simply not empirically true, right? But then the next thing he says is that gangs and organized criminals and stuff are going to tell the recruits, oh, don't go and buy a weapon. Just, snatch your dad's weapon and bring it over here. First of all, guns tend to be, no thank you, registered, right? You fire a bullet, forensics find it, they have a look at it, look at a code, can track it back to your dad, you eventually end up in jail for using that gun, right? We don't think that people will just turn to those sorts of, no thank you, those sorts of guns in order to perpetrate crime. Now, this notion finally where basically discrediting what we said about Switzerland because minor point really, but Switzerland didn't get invaded because it was neutral, Finland whatever, right? Greece was neutral. Benito Mussolini came knocking at our door, saying that he needed to pass through Greece on the way to Africa to butcher people there as well. We sort of got dragged into the World War, as we also mentioned in round 2. Neutrality has nothing to do with it. It is harder to sort of try to screw over a population, whether it's your own population or a neighboring country's population, if you think that they have actually the right to defend themselves. No, thank you. Now, moving on to a few other ideas, right? So crime. So Marco's already told you that, obviously there are asymmetries in society and the government is only able to protect your right to self-defense to the effect where its agents can be present. This leads to a very significant problem, we believe. It leads to the problem that, unfortunately, most policing tends to be reactive, so after the crime has happened, rather than proactive in terms of preventing the crime. In order to be effectively proactive, given that there exists a human incentive to commit crime, the police should be outside everyone's door. Unfortunately, that is just not possible. What does that mean? It means that the state, when it claims there's a right to self-defense, is unable to police people from crimes that have irreparable damages, such as, for instance, murder or rape, which, however, are caused by the asymmetry of force and our asymmetry to be able to use force based on our personal characteristics, right? If Theo wants to kick my butt, he'll probably be able to because he goes to the gym 5 times a day and I don't, right? This probably gets even worse when we talk about the elderly, for instance, versus younger, more agile people and so on and so forth, right? Most of these crimes which cause irreversible damage are caused by that very asymmetry. We think that the state should recognize that people should be exceeding their human limitations by having the right to bear arms to fix that asymmetry. Also, we talked about democracy, right? And they largely ignored it. We think that basically it's worth reminding you that it's better if a government if a government knows that they can't abuse the rights of their citizens if they bear weapons. We think that it's better if the government knows that they have limits before they go on and enact policies. They say, but wait, we shouldn't enact policies based on the assumption that our country can go bust or our country can get destroyed or invaded or so on and so forth. Constitutions exist in most countries, okay, bar the UK, but everywhere else that's normal and civilized, has a constitution that basically says 2 things. 1, citizens are expected to fight for that system in case it's about to collapse, in which case they need guns to do it. And two, the government is limited from abusing its citizens, and there's no better safeguard against that than having arms around society. We're very proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and would like to recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to further debate for the Opposition side.
I feel I'm missing a piece of paper somewhere. See, the reason why we talk about the USA all the time is because the USA is probably one of the only major massive countries in the world that legalizes en masse the right to bear arms. And the question you have to ask yourself is this. Is the right to say to the NRA, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want, be happy with the family heirloom, or be happy that you can defend yourself like a macho man, genuinely worth having one country, the USA, outstrip Britain, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, put together in the number of gun-related deaths in a single year? His only real response to this philosophical problem, that your right not to die is probably more important than your right to bear arms, is basically this. Well, we legalize cars as well, don't we? Basic point. Cars let you get around quickly. Cars are essential to the economy. Guns do nothing but let us kill you. This is the basic argument that's permeated basically the case of the opposition. And I'm going to ask 3 questions to demolish their case. Number 1, government abuse. Why, that's a horrible point. 2, self-defense and public safety. Who ensures it? Well, 4 points rather. 3, the black market. And 4, severe inequity of harm done. 1, state collapse and government abuse. His point is, if you're an oppressed minority, you can fight the state. First of all, I have an aircraft. I have a tank. You have a pistol. I will win. No. Second of all, Switzerland and Finland are their only real examples. Here's a fact check. Switzerland doesn't actually give you the right to bear arms. It gives conscripted soldiers the right to bring home their gun and make sure they never fire it because the ammunition they have is in a sealed bottle. Every time they shoot a single round, they write a report justifying and explaining why they had to shoot at someone. That's not really a right to bear arms, and that's why Switzerland doesn't allow you to walk into the local Walmart and purchase a hand pistol for yourself. Nonsensical example. No. Second of all, notice how their argument degenerates into, to protect myself from the state, I will encourage separatism. Why is that? Because if they want to combat state oppression, the way they do that is by organizing people to armed forces, generating essentially civil wars. His example was Mexico. Here's the thing, he's probably talking about civilian militias that defend little villages and little favelas, not favelas, but little communities in Mexico. My response is, number 1, no thank you sir, there is not necessarily a very strong track record of success. Number 2, this is essentially the state creating for itself a civilian militia, completely sponsored by the state and not granting a full-scale right to bear arms on their own. And number 3, bear in mind that many of these individuals, because they feel seduced by power and because drug cartels come up to them and say, you are a wonderful crack shot, eventually join those drug cartels. Giving people the right to organize themselves in response to the state is either a recipe for civil war, or number 2, a recipe for strengthening the very people you're trying to fight off. No thank you, sir. 3, he says, well, policy changes will occur, right? Because we start to think about people who have guns, like the black community in the USA. Number 1, surely if they're an oppressed minority, in the vast majority of situations, there is already a myth that these people are dangerous, that these people are horrible. What you do is turn them into scapegoats and justify policies like racist profiling, or racial profiling rather, through the back door, saying, well, given that so many of these people, no thank you sir, have guns and are a danger to our society, we jolly well better make sure we increase police presences there, and fight them off. The last point it gives us is that World War II happened. World War II did happen, but we didn't fight them off because we had a state militia. We fought them, no thank you sir, because we had bigger guns and bigger planes than them, and Germany decided to try invading Russia and froze to death. No thank you sir. Second point, public safety, self-defense. They say the police are not always around. My response, make them be around more often. 2, increase criminal penalties to increase the level of deterrence. Why is it unjustifiable to increase deterrence in order to make sure, no thank you sir, by means of giving people, individual people, guns? Well, basically, first of all, if the response is going to be, well, we can't possibly increase the amount of police supervision all the time, right? No thank you, because countries are understaffed. The countries that are least likely to have a police presence are also the ones least likely to be able to police the unlawful and illegal use of guns, which means you escalate the potential for dangerous crime in those societies without any preventive mechanism. Moreover, the self-defense point, no, is absolutely nonsensical. He says, the intruder will think twice before charging into your house. No, he's going to either be A, more panicked, and once you pull out something that resembles a gun like a stick, he shoots you first, first because he thinks, maybe that guy has a gun. No, thank you, sir. Or second of all, he learns how to rob and burgle your house just a little bit better because criminals somewhat have experience in these things, right? You simply make criminals more likely to want to make themselves more dangerous. No. What about other situations that are not someone robbing your house? Because guns aren't gone for all perpetuity, right? Sometimes you escalate domestic skirmishes. This was what Ashish was talking about to you. There are so many potentials for accident, right? What if your kid steals your gun from your house and goes around an accidental rampage or shoots himself? What if someone, no thank you sir, is mentally challenged and mentally ill and decides to take that gun and run around? More importantly, what if two people are simply fighting? Instead of just using their fists or knives, you're now going to use guns. Surely that's not a worthwhile cost to bear, right?
Sir.
No, thank you, sir. We also pointed out to you that the potential of misuse is massive. And this is where I'm going to transition to start discussing organized crime units. He says, no, organized crime units don't use RPGs and rifles. One, the example of Mexico kind of points out that this is nonsense, this is wrong already. But second of all, bear in mind now, you don't only have organized crime units that are mafias and extremely rich and well-policed and well-funded, right? Now you make it possible for crime units to be loose organizations, like the ones that take place in the ghettos of the United States. Individuals are saying, I'm the biggest boss, no, thank you, sir. I'm the leader of your gang, and then tells vulnerable young black youth who desperately crave a sense of belonging, no thank you sir, I want you to join my gang, and to prove your allegiance, pick up and steal a gun from your mom or dad's closet, come here and shoot that person in front of me. His response, no thank you sir, is registration. My response to that is, that makes it, number one, even worse. Why is that? Because the vulnerable people who are most likely to end up in jail as a result of your policy, making it more possible for them to commit massively violent crime, no thank you sir, is what creates such massive inequality in society. And second of all, the guy's already dead, right? No matter how much investigation you do, nothing is genuinely going to change. So honestly, their argument's nonsense. Third argument, no thank you sir, about the black market. They say, the black market exists in Britain as well. We concede. Our response is, we make it easier and better to crack down on this black market. Why is that? Because Ashish gave you a line of analysis, no thank you sir, that investigations become much more efficient, right? Oh, sorry, I didn't take a POI, apologies. Investigation becomes much easier. Because simply, people don't just say, we're going to cut off supply routes here and there and deter them from doing these things. They want to find out where these gangs are getting their guns from, right? You make it much more difficult for them to do so, simply because now licensed outlets can say, well, my ammunition is being used for legal purposes and not illegal purposes, because these things tend to be agnostic across different types of guns, right? So investigation becomes far more difficult in their case, and that's the reason why in so many situations, well, there are other factors as well, countries that legalize guns en masse find it much more difficult to get rid of black markets. Last point, severe inequality of harm. Closing opposition come and say, government rather, come and say, women should have the right to bear arms, want to make it equal, right? No. In the present status quo, guns, especially in the United States and different countries like that with a culture of guns, treat guns as family heirlooms, hunting equipment, right? That means they pass it down from male to male to male to male. What does this mean? The ones most trained to use these guns and most culturally acculturated to using guns are men. That's the reason why, statistically speaking, the people who are most likely to shoot other people are usually dudes, and second of all, most likely to shoot their wives or their partners in situations of domestic abuse. Basically, the inequalities of harm, if they weren't already bad enough, become even more exaggerated in their world. I am so proud to oppose this motion.
We thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his speech and would like to welcome the member of the government to open the second half of this debate. Hear, hear.
What they're conflating is the reason for an immoral act with the tool for the immoral act. What is happening here is every time they say, more men kill women, it's not because people have guns, it's because we don't define the right to bear guns as universal, and we should make it more so, and we should educate people. When they say, but the black kids shoot themselves, it's because we have a power asymmetry we need to, work with, and it wouldn't go away if we took the guns away. They would kill each other with other tools. So if it's so immoral to kill somebody which is in a power relation, we have to find a mechanism which evens it out. And let us go step by step and show you how the mechanism they're proposing of taking the guns away doesn't solve the problem, because the problem is obviously in the power relation. If they identify that it's an immoral act to kill somebody, it actually makes it harder to solve the problem in the comparison of guns. And our extension is going to be going to more of what makes a right universal and how this applies and what it is a right in the first place. So we're going to go philosophical, which a lot of people hate, but hey, debate, reason, philosophy, good, right. First point. They say, the USA people kill each other, the reason why we cannot evaluate whether more people or less people would kill each other is because we don't have statistics as to how deterrent a certain effect is. This is the reason why, for example, a lot of people would feel a lot of people would take a gun when they go to a black ghetto and they wouldn't shoot at each other, but they would warn each other and call each other out, hey, I have a gun, which means you actually open up a conversation. And this is why policemen, when they act in black ghettos, because they might be more dangerous because of the deterrence, actually have a way to say, let's stop, let's try to communicate what is happening, let's shoot at each other, let's call each other out saying, you have to stop right now, I have to cite your rights out right now, in comparison to the previous state where only the police had the monopoly of guns and they were going and shooting black people and there was black violence, which was not acceptable, right? So having a monopoly of having a monopoly and not a general right, which is going to come to that, is very harmful. Which comes to the second point of analysis, and this is the government monopoly. And they say, but Finland and Switzerland are separate examples. Yes, but we have the other side of the coin, when we saw that when you have a monopoly, when not everybody wears guns, but the government is the one who has arms, is actually very harmful. Almost every genocide was conducted by the person who was in power, having the tools and the weaponry onto the minority, which couldn't fend for itself. You want examples of the other side of the coin? Look at Africa and the Balkans, of how it didn't work to have a universal right to bear guns, and we think that we have to stop the government monopoly. Why? And this is a smaller point of extension, but I still like it, right? Because any monopoly leads to abuses. It's not just economy, with no debates, it wasn't in any round in this debate tournament, but we know it in general. If you have a monopoly, you have a privilege and not a right, and you can exert that privilege, and therefore you create another power, asymmetry, because you're the one who wields more freedom regarding certain exhibitions of what you can do in wielding your power in comparison to the others. Meaning that on a philosophical level, if it's not a universal right, and only some parties have the guns, and we think that would be the status quo because the police would still have certain arms in comparison to the rest of the population because that's what they're endorsing, we have an asymmetry which always can lead to the potential abuse. But they say, but we shouldn't mandate governments based on what happens because governments, should be mandated, should be done in the way that it always stay there. Well, what we have to tell to that is a very irrational position if we believe that our government is always going to be there for us unless we do something for it. The black community didn't get out of the oppression until they stepped up and did something as first. On the second point, all of the imperiums and civilizations have fallen. So there is no guarantee that the society as we know it right now is going to continue. There have been invasions, there have been civil wars. So as far as I'm concerned, as a rational being, if I take my self-defense and if my government cannot provide for my self-defense, but actually leads to the possibility of abuse, I think I have the ethical right to defend myself or at least secure myself because the probability is dangerous enough. It's called knowing recent history and not trusting your government, right? Yes, Ashish.
In the vast majority of civil conflicts in Africa, both sides were quite heavily armed. Did that lead to a de-escalation of conflict and a peaceful resolution?
Sorry, I'm not saying that it's a perfect world. I'm saying it's a better world than having a genocide, as in Rwanda, when one side had the arm. I'm not endorsing the perfect solution. I'm endorsing the better solution. And this is what I'm arguing for. I'm not accepting you have to be perfect in order to argue this. Now we come to the last point, the whole women don't defend themselves, it's a guy passing down to the guy. Yes, that's the problem. It's not perceived as a universal right, and it should be perceived as a universal right. Because perception is part of making a right universal or not. If I'm a woman or a black person who don't perceive to be part of the society and don't apply for certain, for example, jobs in education, it doesn't matter if I have a formal right. A universality means that there needs to be a perception as well. And this is the aspect of the universality which is missing in order for those people to acquire and exert their right for self-defense. And this is why we have problems of women or elderly being attacked. But let us go to the analysis of rights, because that was missing. We have thrown this world around a lot without explaining it. What are rights? We think that we have three categories of rights, and the right of bearing arms falls under all three of them. One of them is the natural rights. What are those? Those are the rights which belong to anybody in virtue of their natural needs. For example, safety, bodily autonomy, what you need. If your body is being attacked, and we saw that your body can be attacked because you have a weirdo in your school who comes in there with a knife, right? Or a gun, or a machine gun, or your fist, it means my body is going to be attacked, and the government, as we know it, does not provide that natural right for me. So there is a need for this natural right to be fulfilled. Second, a right can be only if it's universal. Given that the current situation as we know it, or the proposed situation as they put it, when we don't have arms, intrinsically has power relationships, because somebody is going to be stronger than you. Somebody is going to be faster than you. There is always going to be an asymmetry. The only way we can provide for universality in terms of everybody can access the same amount of rights is giving everybody the same right, which is I can kill you in an instant by pressing the button, irrespective of how fragile, weak, womanly, hysterical, uneducated, whatever you want, right? So this is evening out the play field, which has not been evened out, and it's never going to be evened out under the proposal. Third point of analysis is the citizen rights. And here is not just the monopoly argument, which we have been saying, is the probability of another individual or your own society attacking you. Given that the probability exists, but rights are the ones who transcend all of the possibilities and are not just specific to a certain occasion, because rights, are supposed to be universal, transcendent through time, always applicable, we think that this right should be applicable in any society as we know it and as is possible. Given that certain societies can be peaceful, such as Switzerland, but others cannot and can attack you, such as, for example, Rwanda society, if I'm part of the wrong minority, I think I actually have to err on the side of cautiousness and have the deterrence effect, which has already been talked about. Because they say, oh, it's a small probability or it's not likely. We say the probability enough violates my right to self-determination because I don't know as an individual whether this right is going to be harmed or not of my bodily autonomy. Therefore, I need to protect myself because the government who I gave part of my autonomy of being a respective citizen doesn't fulfill this right back to me, either by the lack of the police, either by attacking me back, or in another way, right? So my citizen right is to arm myself. Because we're evening out the playing field, which would never be evened out, because it's a natural right of self-defense, and because the government can never provide for me, we beg you to propose.
We thank the government member and would now like to recognize the opposition member to open this debate for the last
A wise man once said, "Guns don't kill people. I kill people with guns." Broadly, 3 points on extension. Firstly, how this is not an effective check on governments and how better alternatives exist. This will largely clash with what we heard from both gov teams. Secondly, about your right to self-defense and how we can limit it. Thirdly, about how this perpetuates a culture of violence which already exists today. Before that, I have several points of refutation. Okay. Firstly, we get this analysis about how rights are a natural thing out of closing up. And we fundamentally disagree with that. We tell you that rights are a societal construct which is only beneficial to the extent to which they can fulfill utilitarian outcomes. Moreover, we don't think that rights are universal. We believe that different societies have a right to define rights in different ways. What does that mean? That means that if you're Swedish, you can consider it perfectly well that you have a right to welfare. But if you're in another country, you don't necessarily have to identify that as the same right. We reject the claim that rights are universal. Moreover, we tell you that, the second thing we hear from them is that actually that the individuals can attack you at a certain moment in time. You have a right to defend yourself nonetheless. Okay, several things here. First, there are different ways in which you can defend yourself. Like, get some pepper spray, buy a fucking dog. We don't care. There are different ways, and they never proven to us why guns are a necessity for that. But moreover, the very fact that people are allowed to bear arms means that actually more people will be able to attack you. Now, if we put this debate in a utilitarian calculus while banning guns and actually reducing the possibility of people owning them, that means that there is a lesser chance of you being attacked. We don't think that governments, when setting policies, should look at what actually violates or doesn't violate a right of a certain individual, but broadly what leads to less crime and less people using those guns. Okay, now, and the last thing they tell us is that this equalizes the playing field. Now, recognize one problem. There already exists institutional racism, like a significant percentage more of black people in the US is incarcerated in comparison with the white population. Now remember that OG said that people who have a criminal record would be excluded from purchasing guns. This is a way in which you actually reduce the amount of people in minorities which are already discriminated in the first place getting a gun. Moreover, there is big societal pressure on certain groups not to act in a certain way. Meaning, okay, today you can have sex outside marriage, you can have a lot of sexual partners, be you a man or a woman, but because there is pressure on women not to have a big amount of partners, they're not able to use that. Consequently, guns are often seen as something which is macho, something which is for strong people, so it is far more socially acceptable for men rather than for women to own them. So those are all things on our side of the house that prove that this only perpetuates harms which already exist. No, thank you. Okay, on to our extension. They tell us, well, basically, this enables people to have a check on governments. Okay, one, you live in a democracy. This is where the debate is set. You have a check on your governments every 4 years. If they do bad policies, you go out and vote for them. Moreover, we tell you that, but they tell us that states can fail sometimes. Okay, we tell you, well, this is basically, okay, calling upon the social contract theory is quite bad, but let's say that should your state fail, it's perfectly okay to own a gun to defend yourself. But once you have an actor, the state, on which you do have an influence, you vote every 4 years, which can defend you, then there is no necessity for you to own a gun. Okay, but moreover, we tell you that this is not necessarily a very powerful check on people. Okay, the Second Amendment worked when the U.S. was liberating itself from British Oxbridge oppression, but now you still have things like the Patriot Act, like extrajudicial killings in the United States, even to a significant amount of the population owns guns. So that doesn't work. But then they tell us Switzerland is excellent because they have, okay, here are the 6 countries with the biggest amount of gun ownership in the world. The USA, Switzerland, Yemen, Serbia, Bosnia, and Mexico. 4 out of these 6 had civil wars in the last 20 years. One is the United States with the biggest murder rate in the world, and they have Switzerland. I don't think it's too much of an assumption to say that there are other reasons why Switzerland is functioning. Like the fact that they're a very rich country. They don't have big societal conflict. They don't have too strong a national identity, and more, no thank you, and they have direct democracy. Okay, your right to self-defense. Firstly, I already pointed out that there are a variety of alternative ways in which you can defend yourself. No, thank you. Secondly, we tell you that the state can provide more defense. So you can spend more money on arming police forces in order to have people defended more. Thirdly, we tell you, and this is where we also limit your right to self-defense here. When we say that there is a significant possibility of you making an excess with the right that was given to you, that's why we curtail it. That's a large reason why drugs are banned, because a lot of people can use them in an irresponsible way. Even to using a certain amount of drugs can probably be beneficial to an individual, but the harms which can come from that are far too big. That's why the state needs to curtail this, because often you can feel scared that someone is trying to rob you, like pickpocket you in a bus, and you can overuse the force because you have an emotional reaction at the moment when you're attacked, and that's when you can't make a rational decision. That's why we have courts, because they decide what is the appropriate punishment for a certain act that an individual does. Don't you agree?
All that he is portraying happens in the US. We agree. But the point is that this happens because many who are mentally disabled and challenged still have a predicament to such a behavior, get the gun because of the lack of the control. We exclude these people from our policy.
That already exists in the US and the status quo. There's a federal database of people who are either incarcerated or have mental illnesses. They can't own guns in the status quo in the USA, but that doesn't stop them from getting them. You already got that explanation out of opening up. I'm not going to repeat it. How does this perpetuate a culture of violence? Now, we tell you there is no fundamental human nature. We don't tell you that people are necessarily born to love each other or kill each other. What's the problem with this? We create our view of the world with the different perceptions and different interactions we have. Now, guns basically present something, a way in which you defend against other people. This presupposes that other people want to make harm to you. Now, what's the problem here? Firstly, when you have this policy, you will probably have more guns in society, or their policy basically doesn't make any sense at all. But moreover, the state is powerful in setting various moral norms. When the state recognizes the right to bear arms as a fundamental one, it recognizes the fact that you have to defend yourself against other people because they are a threat to you. This is hugely problematic, because this is the moment where people start seeing other people in society as adversaries, as someone who can attack them, as someone who can endanger them, as someone who can commit violence to them. This precisely perpetuates the perspective that you have of other people, and this is precisely what makes you fear other people more, and actually this leads to the increase in crime, because you believe that other people are out there to get you. So you have this vicious circle which goes on and on. Because this is not a value check on government, because your right to self-defense can be limited, and it perpetuates a culture of violence, I'm very proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for his speech and would like to recognize the government whip to conclude this debate for the government side.
Wise men once said, guns do not kill people. I kill people with guns. It is very strange from the side of the opposition to use this sentence, because this is the basis on which we try to give you our story. This is the usage, their perception of guns as tools, our perception of guns as rights. And Theo has already shown you, and I will further explain you why we need it as a right, not just as a tool. But before I continue with my 2 points of 2 clashes that escalated in this debate is on the individual level, why this right is so essential and so important for the people, and on the level of government-people relations, why we also believe this is so important. But before I do that, a couple of points of rebuttal. First points relate to the opening opposition that basically shows us every type of misusage of any tool that you could possibly imagine in this world that can happen. Yes, the consequences of using guns are great, but the consequences of using guns rather than irresponsibly driving cars hasn't been proven why this is so worse. People die in both ways, right? In both situations. Giving them their baby crying over how women do not defend themselves, they do not usually wear arms, has already been explained by Theo. It is because of the rhetorics that guns aren't a right, that guns are a tool of important and tough men that use it for hunting, for fighting other men. We say it if we perceive it as hunting other men. If we perceive it as a right, then we say that it is far more likely to believe that each individual, being black, being minority, being woman, has this right to self-defense, has this right to control their lives and their bodily integrity, which is the most important here. No, thank you. Then Syriza stands up and says, basically, what we're doing here is saying that it is enough for people to have democracy, because democracy always works so well. When your government decides that your rights are infringed, that safety of your country is infringed, that army isn't enough, imagine you, and needs to mobilize the society. The only way, and it is a democratic government, right? You have no ways of acting against that government, against that mobilization, and you're basically almost instantly forced by government's weapon to go into the war and fight. This is when we say no to the government. This is when we say we have rights to self-defense. If we believe that our rights and our lives are infringed, we have the power to control it, and we have the means to control it, because we have the right to bear guns, not you to have guns, and to decide above all. And then they say we have so many problems during civil wars. Look what happened in Balkans. In Balkans happened precisely what I showed you before. That government decided that your safety is endangered. That government decided that we should go to war and that you should be a part of a war. This is a problem. Where do we see the beautiful thing of having arms during war on Balkans is the example of Sarajevo, where communities gather together in defense their own lives, their own buildings, regardless of whether they're Croats, regardless of whether they're Bosnians, regardless of what their governments say. This is people taking control over their lives. This is people with the right to bear arms and to defend themselves in this way, made any progress to establish their independence of what governments say. Yes, Ashish, sorry for that.
So you think that people have a natural right to bear arms. Can you give me an example of a kind of arm that you don't think people are allowed to bear, and why do you have that limitation on that right?
Who says that we have an example that we need it? We say that you can use anything you want to defend themselves, including and first and foremost using weapons. Why? 2 points of clashes on the individual level. Because nobody has shown us on the side of the opposition that we don't live in Hobbesian society. That eventually you know and you can always trust the people and you can always trust the government to protect you against bad people. We still are faced with the very important things that can infringe our bodily integrity, that can infringe our property within their perfect world. We still see that we cannot fight someone being stronger if
this is about women and rape and everything else. You cannot always hope that the policeman will arrive. You cannot always hope that you would be perfect in these issues when government says you're capable of having arms or not, and then woman with poor eyesight goes and she's not allowed to wear arms, right? We cannot always depend on the idea that the limitations are enough to make us feel safe and that we have control mechanisms to make us feel safe. Because on the individual level, we're still dependent on communities, but also on our ability to individually defend ourselves in order to be part of that community. We believe this is the right that it is most important for us. Second thing, and this is very important for the side of the closing government, government-person relation. This is why we say the idea that anybody has the monopoly over your life, the monopoly of using force to defend you, no thank you, to defend you, to act in front of you, to decide in front of you is bad. This is why we believe that it is bad to wait for courts for women who might be raped or people who might be robbed, to somebody comes to save them or the court to decide that somebody did something bad. We believe that some points need instant reaction. We say that we need that instant reaction even in the government-person relationship. We say that governments abuse this monopoly. We say that people need to defend them. Where do we see it? We see it when you decide to refuse to give in the part of your territory that is under threat. For example, Slovenia giving a part of their territory to Croatia. They never asked people within that territory whether they want to be a part of that state. They just decided on basis of their interest what is the safety of the citizens and what is the interest on the government. We say that people should decide what their interests are. People should decide whether they have the right to defend themselves, not to wait on government to decide whether they are part of their territory to defend their lives. We say because all of these things, because they haven't shown us it is not the right, they've shown us that it is a tool that can be misused, because we have shown you that we need it to be a right, we beg you to propose this motion.
We thank the government for her speech and would like to recognize the opposition to conclude this debate for the opposition to the debate as a whole.
Broadly speaking, Madam Speaker, or Sir Speakers, or however you are, society isn't per se Hobbesian, Lockean, or anything else. Society is, well, I don't know how many of you are speaking. It's what we make of it. And their model, plus the modern culture that precipitates and instigates violence and competitiveness, creates an aura, well, a narrative where people are more likely to have guns, own guns, and use guns as augmentation of the persona. You can have weak people trying to achieve their machoism through weapons, through using weapons, effectively harming people around them because they haven't thought it through. You can buy a gun for $28 in a freaking Walmart with a simple ID check. We believe that current gun control is so bad that we need to continue telling people that it isn't a right. We're sending the wrong message by their model, effectively by telling them that because it is right that you have a right to own it, you have a right to use it, that you should use it. It's a positive language thing. If we use a negative language thing, if we continue telling that it isn't inherently a right, it isn't something ingrained in the UN Charter, it isn't something which is a socially constructed national right or whatever, no thank you, people will start using it less. On a broad utilitarian calculus, which we're propping here for side of opposition, we should ban it if risks are too high, if potential risks outweigh but the potential benefits. Like with drugs and other substances, gun control is failing. And before I begin to sum up this debate in two very broad clashes, one of them mostly morale and philosophy, which came on the closing half of this debate, and the later one more pragmatic, which happened in the opening half, I have to tell you one thing. Every society which has legal booze should not have legal guns, because when people allow themselves to be induced in a state of alternate mindset, they cannot control their actions, and we're effectively giving them a way to use it. I cannot ever punch any one of you hard enough as hitting you with a .357 directly between your eyes. No. So basically, what happened here in this debate on moral grounds, right? So firstly, they come propping here that we're going to have some sort of a protection, deterrence, equalization of unequal cultures, the check on government. Well, basically, this is mitigated through several things propped up by opposition. Firstly, a lot of us tell you that people tend to have visceral emotional reactions in which precipitates the fact that guns can be misused on a broad level. But secondly, that people with asymmetric social groups can misuse guns because currently they have the monopoly on the mechanism of acquisition of guns. Not only is our society telling you that if you're not that you're a manly man if you use a gun, and that women shouldn't use guns. Moreover than that, we're encouraging you to use them, which is why, like Ashish said, we have more people shooting their wives in the kitchen. But moreover than that, the acquisition and the social pressure of usage creates a third thing, which is this bleed-over effect. You have passed around guns. You have fathers teaching their sons how to shoot guns. I know a guy who has a trophy elephant rifle back home, right? And we're number 4 on the 6 list. But moreover than that, guns create this other thing. It empowers you. You have this aura of invincibility because you have guns, because society continues telling you through this vicious circle of the culture of violence and competitiveness, you can achieve more if you have this extension of your manhood. For instance, take Texas. Texas has the single greatest concentration of firearms in the United States of America, and they wanted to secede a few years back and have Chuck Norris as their president. You're more likely to act rash and against your oppressive government, not only if your government is trying to oppress you physically, but moreover than that, if your government is trying to oppress you, for instance, economically, if your government is perceiving your legal system to be not just but white justice, the perception of minorities, then you're more likely to go against them. You're more likely to rely on yourself than on the democratic mechanisms which are currently here, because you have this concrete and predictable set of actions if you use a gun or any other given weaponry for that instance, rather than this abstract and much less concrete thing when you use mechanisms of democracy. No, thank you. But moreover than that, on a moral level, what do we have here? 3 very broad points brought up by our extension. Firstly, how this is not a check on your government. Secondly, how the self-defense, this morality, self-defense, pseudo-legal approach is bad. And lastly, how the culture of violence is merely being precipitated. So firstly, they tell us that you can have a check on your government. Well, no, you can never have enough guns the way your government has guns. Secondly, you're actively being encouraged and discouraged through this gun control to use them or not to use them. But more than that, you can't really control your government because they A, know better than you, B, have better weaponry than you, and C, know exactly through their registration mechanism where something that they sold are. And plus, more than that, they can't really control the intakes and outtakes of these guns because you do not have a unified regulation all around the world. Wouldn't you agree?
Control of violence exists when you have labeled some groups being violent or having means to use this violence. This is black groups, discriminated groups, this is criminal groups. This is where you perpetuate the vicious circle of violence. When you say violence is determined only for those groups, guns do not represent violence.
Sure they do. Guns represent violence in every single movie, song, comic book, pop culture book that I ever read, that most of you probably have read. You're being bombarded with the pop culture that promotes that guns are the ultimate weapon, weapon, due to lack of a better word, the ultimate weapon of solving conflicts. If you have a stereotypical notion that a certain group is harmful to the society, if you have a stereotypical notion that a certain group is more likely to be violent and more likely to engage in a violent discourse with you, then that group has this self-fulfilling prophecy notion where they continue using them because, hey, everybody's telling me that I gotta join a gang or play sports if I'm a minor in the black community in the Bronx or in the projects and whatnot. So, and that fulfills this whole idea. No, thank you. So basically, and now to sum up with this whole rights idea that was propped up by closing up. Firstly, we tell you that rights are a societal construct. Rights are only usable and are only acceptable if you have this, and I hate to use it, a social contract kind of thing, right? Your rights are limited by my rights, so in order not to harm anyone else. But even these rights differ from state to state, and this relies on my previous point that you do not have this unified, coordinated control and registers of guns, right? The United States has like a Bill of Rights which has 25, Belgium has 10, Serbia has none. So basically, we see that we don't have reached any consensus on rights whatsoever. Moreover than that, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, if we believe that if your state fails you, and that if your state creates a situation where you need to use guns, then the social contract is off.
and no rights exist, and then we're in a state of anarchy. Then your usage of guns is not something passed on to you by higher authority, but moreover something which is a basic necessity of survival. So for all of these reasons, for the fact that we have better mechanisms and alternatives of self-defense, that we will never have the best check and government possible, and for the fact that we're simply perpetuating the culture of violence and competitiveness currently present within the status quo, we are very proud to oppose this motion.